Hello, welcome to all the participants. Thank you so much for being with us here today. My name is Paulina Raniecka, and I work as the affiliated researcher for the NEWAVE Innovative Training Network. Today is the 6th appointment of the thematic seminar series, which is a part of the NEWAVE Diffused conference. It started at the beginning of April and will be accompanying us until the end of the year with biweekly online webinars. The thematic seminar featured the NEWAVE early stage researchers that will guide us through the key water governance aspects that they have been investigating during the NEWAVE project. Today's seminar will start with Stew, and Stew Motta has been focusing on the Mekong region, and his presentation is titled Immaterial Flows and Hydropolitical Tensions in the Mekong region's transboundary rivers. Before I pass on to Dr. Johanna Kuhler, who is the co-supervisor of STU, I kindly remind everyone to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. You can start using it right away, and we will have a designated Q&A section at the end of STU's presentation and the discussion that follows shortly after. Now passing on to Johanna for the official introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. And hello, everybody. My name is Johanna Kuhler. I'm an assistant professor of environmental risk governance in the Public Administration and Policy Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'm delighted to be here with you today. And it's also my great pleasure to introduce Stew Motta's talk, as you've just heard on the title, Immaterial Infrastructure and Hydropolitical Tensions in the Mekong Region's Transboundary Rivers. Stew has worked in the Mekong region for over a decade, supporting research initiatives through the CGIAR's Water, Land and Ecosystems Greater Mekong Program, and also the Mekong Region Futures Initiative. And I also had the pleasure of already meeting Stew at the University of Oxford in 2019, where I was the water program manager and teaching water policy when he came there to do his MSc in water science policy and management. And now he's at the tail end of his PhD at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, which has been a fascinating journey. And but also it's been marked by various challenges, of course, the COVID pandemic being one, but also the outbreak of armed conflict in Myanmar. So he certainly, had to navigate various challenges throughout. I worked with a number of PhD students, all centered around the governance of water-related risks. And Stew specifically is focused on what forms conflict and cooperation take in the basins with the highest risk of conflict due to large-scale dam projects. And everyone on this call will have heard the hypothesis that the wars of the 21st century will be fought over water. And Stew's research is really driven by a deep curiosity in how dams are affecting conflict and also cooperation. And a deep strive to contribute to new empirical insights that go beyond sort of standard hydro hegemony claims. And Stew first provides very important insights onto the financialization of rivers and how the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol subsidized hydropower projects in the Mekong region's basins at risk. So a bit of a spoiler that 4 basins are at very high risk along the Mekong River, were the sort of top recipients, and he'll tell you much more of these large-scale dams. So more information will be shared by him soon. And then he goes in to zoom into the sort of top 2 river basins at risk that received large-scale CDM hydropower projects. The Red River, and the focus here will be particularly on Vietnam and China, and the Salween River. So here the focus particularly on Myanmar and Thailand, which have very different trajectories. On one river, they haven't built the expected infrastructure, the expected dams. On the other, most CDM projects have been built. So you'll tell us more what the implications for conflict and cooperation are along these river basins. And also he'll draw on various theoretic frameworks, including the idea of telecoupling and the actions in, for example, Europe or China can be offset in a distant basin, but it has far-reaching implications for the local populations. And then for also the twins matrix on the coexistence of cooperation and conflict, and then moving more into this idea of downstream pragmatism in transboundary water governance when you have to deal with an enormous information gap. And then finally, also looking at hydro hegemony. Scale is a very important concept, but it's very often focused on the geospatial part, geospatial scale, with a basin as a sort of natural unit, sometimes also the administrative scale. And Stew provides here important evidence for an understudied scale in this context, namely the temporal scale, in a very regulated basin like the Red River. And he's really looking into the disruption of the temporal scale and how that can lead to tension and the risk of conflict. So that's an overview of what and situating sort of Stew's wider research. After that, we are delighted that we have another fantastic speaker with us who will be discussing Stew's work. Dr. Kyung-Mi Kim is a researcher at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University in Sweden, focusing on the intersection of climate change and insecurity, and also examining how climate resilience building can mitigate the risk of conflict and fragility. And her research really looks at transboundary water conflict and cooperation, but also environmental peace building and the role, again, of information, of AI in climate and environmental policy. And we're particularly delighted to have her with us today because she's done extensive research also on civil resistance in the shadow of war and explaining popular mobilization against dams in Myanmar. So nobody could be better suited to be here with us today to discuss Stew's PhD work. But for now, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Stew. It's been really a fascinating journey, and I'm extremely excited about what you have achieved. Over to you.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you, Kyung-Mi, for being here. That was a great introduction, and I agree, Kyung-Mi is the best possible fit to be the discussant for this afterwards. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm just going to kick this off so we have time for Q&A. At the start, I'd also like to mention that Aaron Wolf is an academic supervisor for this project, and a lot of this work builds on his and the work his group does. Namely, they monitor the world's transboundary rivers, and they also evaluate which one of them are at risk of conflict. So these are like the basins at risk, and we'll come back to that. And Aaron is very famous for kind of disbanding this water wars inevitable paradigm and showing that cooperation is much more likely in shared river systems. However, even though cooperation is more likely, there are still many instances of conflict and hydropolitical tension. And the most direct links to this are around infrastructure construction. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. And both Aaron's work and many others who put forward ideas around hydropolitics did their PhD research in MENA, or the Middle East and North Africa. So I learned a lot from these people's work who came before me. But some of the struggles that I had was applying these ideas into the Mekong context, because one thing we know is water governance is highly contextual. And so some of the ideas and things we're talking about today is actually going to be a bit of my struggle during the PhD process to get some of these concepts to fit in a different geography. So first, it is good to mention that this is now in mainstream discourse. If I am in a taxi and I tell someone I work in hydropolitics, I usually get one or two responses. If I'm in Europe, they talk about Ethiopia building the GERD on the Nile. And if I'm in Asia and I say something like that, people will talk to me about, oh yeah, China's building all these dams. And I think this cartoon really does this justice, where we kind of, when we think about this, it's typically a narrative of a large dam on the mainstream of a river, where a country has the dam, the water, and the power. And often these are they're narratives of scarcity. This is sort of a zero-sum game where one country has and the others will not. And upstream and downstream is extremely important. And as Johanna mentioned, it's typically looked at in terms of power relations as one nation having hegemonic power over another. this is some of the complexities when trying to bring that into the Mekong region. You have a flurry of infrastructure construction, maybe some of the most rapid dam rollouts anywhere in the world. It is a monsoonal climate, so these river systems have the largest differentiation between wet and dry season anywhere, and it's not arid. And in many cases, conflict and tensions here are not related to water availability. Territorial disputes or land is actually much more controversial typically. Upstream and downstream dynamics are also much more complicated. For example, in the Mekong region, Vietnam is both upstream and downstream in the same river system. And it's further enhanced by the fact that countries like China, Thailand, and Vietnam are also building dams in their neighboring countries. Again, sort of blurring the lines of the nation state and who's up and who's down. These hydropower corporations are also state-owned enterprises, so it's a little bit more difficult to see where the state stops. And the power dynamics are changing very drastically, probably some of the fastest in the world with the rise of China. And so the sort of changes in power dynamics over a very short period of time have been altered significantly. And if you see this graphic on the left, there's only 14 projects that have ever been canceled. So there's lots of momentum behind these infrastructures once they're conceived of. And that's sort of regardless of what else is happening in the world. So they'll appear and reappear over decades, regardless if we invent solar power or whatnot. The dam typically remains. And so we're dealing with a very complex and a very lasting phenomenon. So the 4 project perspectives we're going to cover correspond to 4 papers that come out of this project. And we're going to take these in turn. So we'll look at financial flows and hydropower's new currencies. We'll delve into the Salween to look at areas of high conflict with non-built dams or dams still in the planning process. Then we'll look at the Red River Basin, where there is a high amount of infrastructure, but no conflict, and try to understand sort of the power dynamics and the hydro diplomacy that is happening there. And lastly, we're going to try to get into the weeds a little bit and dissect this relationship between infrastructure and tensions. And looking at Chinese and Vietnamese relations in the Red River Basin, we're going to get into sort of what makes a tension. So first, this work combines Aaron's database with the UNFCCC's CDM registry of large-scale dams that the UN program subsidized. The CDM is the key offset scheme globally, and the CERs mentioned in the quote are carbon credits, and those are seen as like the global standard. And this research was possible through a collaboration with Isabella Bach, who is a master's student I had the pleasure of supervising and working with at the FU Amsterdam. And she was able to expand some of the things I was working on in the Mekong to a global database, a global GIS work. And so this is the outcome of plotting 1,055 hydropower projects, large-scale hydropower projects, and seeing how they fell on the world's shared rivers. And in the table on the left, you can see the outcomes of this and where most of the projects are cited. The rivers in red are considered basins at very high risk. So of the over 300 basins that Aaron's group monitors, only 22 globally are considered very high risk. And as you can see, the top 4 basins to receive UN-subsidized large-scale hydropower are all basins at very high risk. So all in this highest risk classification. And so we're seeing 2 things happening here. The CDM is subsidizing hydropower in the riskiest rivers in the world, and the top 5 rivers to receive this are in one geography, the Mekong region. So we see this as also a form of cost shifting, where carbon reduction claims and sort of emissions reduction commitments in Europe are being outsourced in high density to the Mekong's transboundary rivers. We argue that this approach to climate change through carbon accounting is essentially water blind. This is a problem for water governance generally, but it's particularly bad for transboundary rivers because the carbon accounting and approvals all occur at a national level. And these are international rivers. So there's no considerations for the international implications of this rapid rollout of hydropower. And it's important to note that this is also still a feature under Paris. that these types of projects are all still being approved at a national level with no considerations of transboundary water governance. So if we're trying to analyze this quite bulky and large global system, how are we going to analyze different geographies that are far away? And we tried to apply the telecoupling framework, which allows to study very distant coupled human and nature systems in our current globalized world to sort of understand maybe farther away environmental outcomes. And we conceive of Europe as the sending system where they send money, typically to Chinese hydropower developers in exchange for carbon credits. And that relationship and those flows are carbon only. There are really no water considerations in that relationship. And this leads the Mekong region to be categorized as a spillover system, where there are like hidden and cascading impacts that don't really appear if you just focus on the relationship of trade around carbon credits. China was the largest recipient of CDM funding, and a lot of the projects approved went into Yunnan province, where many of these rivers flow through, a quarter of them actually. And the problem is that the CDM supercharged hydropower construction, particularly in Yunnan, and now these rivers are overbuilt. So every year, these hydropower dams sit idle, particularly in the monsoon. They cannot send energy into the grid. It's also becoming an issue in the dry season now, as China has recently, in the past few years, receiving chronic drought. And these poor performances and inefficiencies are very significant, and they occur every year. So this isn't a project by project. This is across the whole system. And with each additional hydropower project that comes online, the problem gets worse because there's more and more excess. And this excess creates what telecoupling would call a second order effect. So now you have all this extra energy that's very cheap, and you get energy intensive industries moving into these river basins to mop up the cheap hydropower. So you see smelting, aluminum smelting, mining, and then very energy intensive Bitcoin currency production. And so building on some of the work of Ehlers and others who view hydropower dams as investment vehicles that are primarily designed currently as financial vehicles where climate change considerations are secondary or even non-existent. And here we can see hydropower actually getting entangled with two new forms of currency, selling carbon credits into the European market and producing cryptocurrencies at the dam sites. So this is, in addition to the traditional forms of finance and development bank, these are kind of new forms of currencies that are coming online. And when they are done in this density, we've described this process as the financialization of rivers, where the financial benefits are outweighing decision-making, and it's disconnected from things like energy demand. Now, inside the CDM portfolio, these are two examples of how this can lead to more direct conflict on the ground. You can see this article on the left, and Burma is 13 years old. The Da Pain 1 was Burma's only large-scale dam to get approved by the CDM. The dam site became violent. The dam was sited in disputed area that the Kachin Independence Army had controlled for decades. They were not consulted as part of this process and viewed the incursion into with Chinese dam developers as an invasion on territory. This ended up with armed clashes and the breakdown of a 17-year-old ceasefire, the resumption of civil war, thousands of people fleeing over the border into China. This all kicked off in 2011. And despite the violence and loss of life, the project was approved to the CDM to sell carbon credits in 2013, 2 years later. Even though the project was not ever completed due to the armed conflict and operates at only a few percentage points of what it purports to do, it was still validated as removing 700,000 tons of carbon a year and sold 700,000 credits into the EU. On your right, you see the TKT project, which is the largest one in Vietnam. And the project site was abandoned by Chinese developers amidst South China Sea clashes. The project did not eventually get constructed and connect to the Vietnamese grid until 2021. but the project was still registered to the CDM in 2012. And so these are examples of how offsetting approaches to climate change create both these zombie credits, in which the legitimacy of the credits themselves is highly questionable, particularly around the energy bottlenecks. But it also these credits are also highly conflictual. And in the end, we actually argue that the water-blind telecoupled system, based on carbon accounting, actually has negative outcomes in all three geographies. Okay, so this photo on the right is of that very dam site. The Dapane one is still militarized. And now but the dam is built, even though they didn't fully complete it. Now we're going to turn to the Salween and look at unbuilt dams. And how these projects are impacting conflict dynamics, even in their abstract stage. And these projects have been in the planning for decades. Project proponents have changed over time, but always one key part of it is that the Burmese military has been a project partner. And the Burmese military also was the project owners that increase the size of these projects dramatically. And this gives rise to the idea that these are being used as forms of territorial conquest. These dams are sited in areas that are disputed once again, and where their groups who they are fighting with have their bases. And then also you can see on the Thai side, these projects kind of become, even in their ideational form, become entangled in larger development schemes. So currently, they are also being connected to these mega projects of water transfers out of the Salween and into the Chao Phraya. As Johanna mentioned, we use Naho Miramachi's twins grid to visualize how these Thai-Burmese relations have changed over time. And what we see is, as Thailand and Burma try to cooperate around dam construction, jointly building infrastructure together, at lower scales, it causes violence and increases conflict dynamics, even though no concrete has ever been poured. So we traced this process through media and events databases, the online Burma library, but crucial to assembling this timeline was Salween gray literature that mostly has been produced by non-state actors and civil society organizations. And then this was also supported by 15 key informant interviews and 5 years of work experience in the country. One way to think about this, to sort of simplify this idea, is that if your area was slated to be flooded or be under a dam, it forecloses other things you would propose to do. You would not ask for a road or a market to be installed if they were eventually going to be underwater. Likewise, if you're a farmer, we heard this as well, where you would not plant long return crops like fruit trees if you did not know if your land would be above water in the coming years, or if your area was going to be militarized to allow for dam construction. So these projects can still impact conflict dynamics even in their immaterial forms. They're reshaping people's decision-making and the landscape. And they're also seen by the Burmese military as sort of an illiberal signal. When they want to open to the West, open up, maybe become more democratic, they cancel controversial dam projects. And then after the most recent coup, illegal seizure of power in 2021, they also promote restarting all of these projects as a way to hold together their securitized relationships with the Thai military and with arms dealers. Okay, so switching to now the Red River Basin. So here we have low levels of conflict, high levels of infrastructure. And the Red River received the most CDM funding for large-scale dams, with 77 being registered on both sides of the border. This is typically something that you would expect to see conflict in, especially because there's a recent history of conflict here. The border wasn't demarcated until 1999, and the CDM is subsidizing dams very near to that border, so that the hydropower in Yunnan has direct implications on water governance in northern Vietnam. There is a 2009 agreement between China and Vietnam where they share limited hydrologic information just during the monsoon season, but they don't cooperate for the rest of the year, and they do not share any information related to hydropower or dam operations. To try to understand this dynamic, fieldwork was carried out in Hanoi and Lao Cai in 2023. Unfortunately, Yunnan was off limits due to the zero COVID policy at the time, but we were able to carry out 45 interviews with my research assistant in northern Vietnam. And I would say typically one of the examples for why there would be no conflict in this arrangement is hydrohegemony, that China has hegemonic power over Vietnam, and therefore this is why the basin is so quiet. But we find this explanation pretty unsatisfactory. And one of the reasons is the politics of scale. And so this Chinese proverb we have over here is one of my favorites. It's like "Shang Gao Huangdi Yuan," which just means the mountains are tall and the emperor is far away. And if you're just focusing on kind of Beijing or the nation-state, nation-to-state, nation-to-nation relations, you're missing a lot of the multi-scale relationships that are within this basin and in the region. In the Mekong, Yunnan has actually been much more proactive and is much more familiar with their counterparts compared to Beijing. And they play key leading diplomatic roles in transboundary water relations. And so we understand that China has considerable power, but that this power is actually fragmented or fractured, and that there are many different interest groups, both in Yunnan and in the central government, that have many different agendas that are often at odds with one another. So we look at this as more of this kind of multi-actor, multi-scale situation. And although geographically Yunnan is upstream, and you would think this would give them some level of power, actually, they also need access to the sea, and Vietnam controls their access to trade and things. So also material wealth, it's these areas are actually much more similar in terms of income. It's a little strange to, for example, count Shanghai's GDP toward the Red River Basin's material power. So we kind of look at, rather than looking kind of more Hanoi to Beijing relations, we see actually a lot more cooperation and stronger relationships across the border, both in the border regions and importantly within the engineering community as well. And rather than hydrohegemony kind of explaining China's power over Vietnam and why we're seeing this relative stability, we actually argue that it's more of Vietnam's downstream pragmatic efforts. And we take the American philosopher John Dewey's idea of pragmatism and uncertainty. He kind of describes coming to a fork in the road and needing to, metaphorically climb a tree to make a better assessment. And Vietnam is doing this across a variety of ways, both internationally and domestic. They're able to, and this also was pervasive across sectors. So this was in universities, ministries, think tanks, what have you. It's pervasive and decentralized, and people are able to monitor Chinese reservoirs from satellite, figure out what's happening in the upper part of the basin without China cooperating. And you see investments in monitoring, machine learning, human resources to reduce Vietnam's risk and to lower these information gaps and lower this uncertainty of them in the downstream. So even though it's not able to overcome China's fractured power relations, overall it is improving the knowledge gaps and limiting the risk to downstream Vietnam. And lastly, looking at what makes attention, as Johanna mentioned, the politics of scale is often geospatial. So you think about administrative areas, what we've just been talking about, provinces versus central governments, rural, urban. But what's missing often is this idea of temporality or timing. And if you look at the cooperation efforts and the pragmatism that Vietnamese actors are displaying, in many cases, what they're trying to address is the uncertainty and the risk caused by the disruption of the temporal scale. This makes sense because this is one of the primary arguments for investing in hydropower, right? You disrupt the temporal scale. You store water now for use at a later time, right? So we're working on centering this sort of when of transboundary tensions. And we think that the timing of these operations, rather than the existence of the dams, is actually where a lot of these issues arise. Vietnam has developed many dams and actually larger than the upstream in Yunnan. So it's not that they're anti-dam. It's more it's more the lack of knowing of when things are going to happen. And you can see this reflected across many of the interviews. Where they're getting into these much shorter timescales. You know, typically when people talk about the temporal scale in hydropolitics, they're talking about historical legacies. But there is this timing of tensions is happening at much more condensed timescales, from seasons down to seconds. And you can see this here, how technology is interacting with some of these, where they're already thinking about how long it takes, you know, to compute these things with machine learning, and how much more time that then gives them to respond to flood risk or to resettle villagers. So we're also trying to flesh out sort of the timing of transboundary tensions. And this has serious implications for hydrodiplomacy, which is Mark Zaitoun and others have remarked is like the least well-defined term in water politics. This gives us a little idea of how this hydrodiplomacy is happening in practice to sort of reduce some of these risks, even with limited cooperation. And I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Kyung-mi to get her thoughts. And let's see. Thank you all for listening. And Kyung-mi, I'd like to hear your perspectives on some of this. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, well, thank you, Stu, for really amazing lecture, and thanks for inviting me to be your discussant. Yeah, thanks for the nice introduction, Johanna, earlier. That was really great. Yes, I think I just want to maybe start by just, you know, praising you for trying to assemble all this really complex basins, the regions, and also the different scales, not only the geospatial, but also temporal, like the timing of things. It's really remarkable work, and I'm really looking forward to see your PhD dissertation completed very soon. So yeah, it sounds really exciting, and I think the most importantly, I think your work really tried to I think we sort of forgot about the importance of power in hydrohegemony for a while. So I think your work really brings back our attention to the issues of power. So where do power, sorry, my rice cooker has started working, sorry. Yeah, so where does the sources of power lies, and how does it change in different scales between actors? So I think that really is the major contribution this work is bringing. And also, I think the Red River, I wasn't very familiar with the context, so I think I learned a lot from your presentation here. So I maybe want to start from there. I think it's really interesting to also show that the hydrohegemony of China is obvious in its source of power, and how it has so much more than the downstream country, Vietnam in this case. But also you highlighted the similarities in these two countries on the approaches to hydropower and their preferences for also the risk management. I think this sort of brings this like situation into sort of this harmonious, just for the moment, right? So that's a really interesting when you think about only the water interactions in the spectrum of conflict or cooperation. So this is a kind of a very interesting status quo that's happening at the moment, which is enabled by this technology in a way that gives assurance to the Vietnamese water users and also the government that they can handle these risks of the upstream dams. So here, I think this concept of this temporality of the risk is really interesting, because this is really true that a lot of the water scarcity that can be caused by that is attributed to dams. It usually comes during the dry season or during the massive flooding occasions when the dams are somehow linked to this water-related disasters. So in that way, I think it's also interesting to think about the idea of accountability, right? Because when you think about water diplomacy and how countries try to negotiate over water, it's not just about it's not just about their right to water or accountability. It's also sometimes it's about calling the other country for not giving the downstream countries or the upstream countries the right to protect their interests, and also, I mean, do no harm. So that's really the bottom line. So I feel like maybe you can say a few words about accountability, and then maybe I just want to shift to the next basin, the Salween. So I think this issue of the conflict caused by unbuilt dams. So I find that quite interesting, because I feel like most of the conflict or cooperation over water infrastructure is the most intense when the things are being planned. Of course, we now see the third filling of the GERD, the Grand Renaissance Dam, and then there is, of course, conflict around that as well. But then most of the very intense discussions and tension, or even conflict at the diplomatic level, it comes when the infrastructure project is announced, when they're planned, when they're sort of known by other countries or the public, then I think the most conflict happens. So actually I feel like maybe is this unbuilt versus built? So how does that really change the conflict dynamics? Maybe the last point, maybe I could ask you for maybe the more input is the CDM and financialization of rivers. I think that's extremely interesting, and I think very policy relevant, because I think we're seeing more and more of this type of mechanisms to incentivize countries to invest more in the renewable energy and also climate adaptation efforts, or the forest conservation, you name it. There are so many of these schemes now that's been promoted as climate action. And I think CDM is a bit of an exceptional one among the financial instruments. I think that even North Korea, that's a country that has almost no access to any international financial mechanisms, they can even apply for CDM. So CDM is really one of the exceptions in this way, that is sort of up for grabs. And I think maybe is that the issue? Maybe it's just a financial arrangement is way too flexible, that anyone can access it if you have the right accreditation and the documents, or is this actually something desirable that we can even entice some countries that are like problematic, they would not consider climate change into their policy? Can we even So is this actually really only bad, or can it also have some positive aspects? Maybe you can reflect on this financial instrument. But I mean, thanks so much for the presentation, and really looking forward to read the papers that will come out. Over to you, Stu.
I'll quickly come in if you don't mind, and thank you, and just invite also the audience to already start thinking about questions themselves, whilst Stu can indeed tackle some of Kyung-mi's very interesting questions. So there is the Q&A function. Please do start writing your questions, which we'll come to right after. But indeed, I think the sort of three key questions for now, very interesting ones, were indeed, how does built versus unbuilt change the sort of conflict dynamics, and also what's the question about accountability here, and indeed CDM, is it something desirable or only bad, and how can it be harnessed? So over to you again, Stu.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I really like the reflection on the intensity sort of ratcheting up when things are being planned. I think that's an interesting kind of temporal issue with this in itself. And we kind of don't think, Holmes talks about, looking at these more in terms of the full life cycle, which we typically don't. I would agree with you. I hear what you're saying, particularly with regard to the GERD. With the Salween, it feels different in that these projects, because they just keep recurring over and over, and they're held in these planning processes for so long. And then, as I said, the changes, I think, within the planning processes are also quite alarming. So, Some would argue that, oh, it's good that we have Chinese hydropower companies and Chinese hydropower expertise working on these projects. And that's true, but if the military is increasing the designs and not the hydrologists, I think that also calls into question like what type of planning we're doing. And I think that's more where this gets into the weeds of the territorial conquest. Like most of those projects were almost doubled in size by the Burmese military. And so yes, controversial in the planning, but like I see like specifically how and where they're citing them, and then who is recommending for these things to be larger and flood out more of their adversaries' land as a bit more insidious. It is interesting, though, how much this is having knockover effects into Thailand, right? And that interbasin transfer originally failed ESIAs, I think, twice before. And then, they were able to kind of push it through during COVID and get it approved. But basically, that project in Thailand is almost inherently involves these dams being built to have enough energy to lift water up and over and through mountain ranges. So it is fascinating how the planning of, even in this planning phase, others start planning off of the planning, and this thing kind of keeps growing, even though there's no real, currently especially, there's no real likelihood that these projects can be constructed. In terms of accountability, in the Red River, I think it's interesting that there's low issues of low trust. And in many cases, the accountability that would be required is actually, I think, located within the very industries that are causing so many of these infrastructure issues. And instead of, hydrologic engineers who speak the same language, who know a lot of these dynamics, and many of whom are familiar with each other, this kind of gets escalated into high politics. And typically between China and Vietnam, the most important political processes are the party to party. And so as these things get into elite politics, the types of people who you'd want in the room to create some of that accountability, to build some of these models together, to sort of keep things in check, essentially get more or less pushed out, whether intentionally or otherwise. And this goes into the Ministry of like Financial Affairs and kind of high level politics. And I think that's kind of what you're missing there. I mean, if you look, and I'll link this to the temporal aspects. So if you look at the type of information that you would need, and let's say for a second that you agree that these hours matter or minutes matter, it's not really realistic that that's going to come through high politics and high political process and foreign affairs, right? I mean, the legitimacy and accountability is going to be within the hydropower sector in Yunnan and in Vietnam. And, these people are more familiar with each other than people think. This is also why, I think this kind of the China having hegemonic power over Vietnam. Many cases, these people are familiar with each other. They've worked together before. They've studied together before. And again, they speak the same language. So I think that the accountability process would be kind of lowering the level of political engagement and frankly, engaging directly with the owners and operators of this infrastructure. In terms of the CDM, I'm not. I do think there's definitely positive aspects. I'm not anti, the CDM or anti trying to finance carbon reduction or things like this. And I believe there probably is positive aspects in looping countries in to some of these ideas that maybe are hard to reach. The frustrating part for me is when I say water blind, I don't mean moderately. I mean, or like hard seeing, I mean blind. You see these project documents and they don't even mention the name of the river they're on. And in the case with the Red River Basin, you're approving a mainstream dam right near a recently demarcated border after armed conflict. It's not just water blind. Like what are we doing here? And I just think there's a total lack of not only water, but just political considerations in how they're going about this. And it wouldn't be such a problem if hydropower didn't make up such a large part of their portfolio. I mean, we're talking 1,055 projects, which is a lot. But when you start looking at the carbon reductions they claim to provide and the percentages of that with inside the EU, it's a bit staggering. So the KTK, as it's known project I mentioned in Vietnam, that just came online in 2021, those credit sales and that single dam are larger than any solar project in the entire CDM globally. Right? So these things are also just much larger pieces of our global response to climate change than we might need to consider. And one last point on the CDM, which I do think gets missed, and I have been asked this on multiple occasions. If I tell people I'm doing this type of research, they kind of say to me, why are you looking in the past? The CDM is over. We're in a Paris era. And that's just not true. The CDM approved hydropower projects in Laos as recently as 2019. Paris was passed in 2015. They are still certifying hydropower projects. And so, and it forms the basis of Article 6.4 under Paris. So many of these things are still kind of moving forward. And I do, although there might be some benefits there, I do have serious concerns about this offset scheme being decided at national levels if you're going to be putting dams on transboundary rivers. It's just a horrible kind of scalar fit. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, both to Stu and also Kyung-Miu, to your really insightful comments and questions that yet again have sparked another discussion. In the interest of time, I'd like to really give the audience the chance to ask a few questions as well. And I see that questions are indeed coming in. So another invitation to everybody who's not yet had a chance to post their question, please type it in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and then we can sort of try and field them. The first question that came in, Stu, was around the framework of telecoupling, and the question whether you witness financial flows from crop production in the basin, and how hydropower development affects the agro sector as another blue water teleconnection. So maybe you can provide a few short thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So this was done as a desk-based study. So I don't have any, specific data of what this is doing to the agricultural sector. I will say, though, generally in the Mekong region and particularly in Yunnan, these are very steep valleys, and same in Laos. Many of the best agricultural zones are in the valley floor, and that's what gets lost when you flood it out to hydropower. So if you started adding up, 274 large-scale projects that all have these reservoirs going behind them that are flooding out primary agricultural land, then yes, I would say it most certainly does.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there is a question a bit more about sort of ethnic minorities. So maybe I'll sort of summarize. There's 2 or 3 questions along that line. Could you comment a different way to improve multi-level governance in order to ensure indigenous communities' rights in regions where large hydropower projects are currently going on? And an example is given here from South America, experiencing also a number of conflicts and tensions related to this. But yeah, there's a few questions also specifically with regard to the role in Myanmar.
Okay, let me see here. Yeah, so to be clear about the CDM, we were just looking at large-scale projects with myself and Isabella Bach, and it was great that she was able to provide this GIS work because it really paints a much starker picture than I had imagined. I knew that there were CDM projects in the Mekong region, but I never thought it was to this dramatic level. So this question from Myanmar about the small scale, that's not even including the small scale. So if we ran this again with the small scale dams, who knows? This is further research that we have discussed pursuing together because, yeah, I don't know if you're going to see a similar process or not. And very interesting question on a mechanism to apply for CDM outside of the Burmese military. Currently, not that I know of, because again, all this stuff is like at a national level. One of the interesting things about the Salween, though, is again what people leave out. And the really depressing part about the Salween River Basin is that you actually have a lot of small-scale hydropower and successful decentralized grids set up and renewable energy, particularly in Shan State. It is so well developed that it might be one of the best decentralized renewable energy grids anywhere in Southeast Asia. And that is entirely glossed over and flooded out by this one narrative of these large-scale dams that, again, have been around for decades, even though on the ground, there has been a lot of success with small-scale projects in the ethnic regions. And I would recommend looking at some of the work by MeNet and others who kind of dig deeper into that. Let's see, what was the other on?
Sorry, can I just plug this? One paper that I did with a Burmese colleague on this independent grid system. Actually, I'll share with you in the chat.
Super. To maybe the question by Meg John on the wider question around the way of decision makers collaborating peaceful with their neighbors, either by making different choices, changing the portfolio away from large-scale hydropower. So how do you see a productive way to respond to nuanced socio-cultural hegemony? And I think it's a very interesting, broader reflection on what you've been presenting.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that one of the things that I would not have expected before doing interviews in the field is when you sort of think about recent armed conflict, borders are sensitive and these sorts of things, and then actually going there and talking to people and seeing how this was happening in practice, I would actually start right there. I would start smaller and be working not at the elite national scale, because there is actually, from the outside academically, we would see conflict and maybe tension, but realistically, these people have friends and families on both sides of the border, right? There are ethnic groups that share cultures and histories on both sides of this border. And I think that like a lot of the potential for changing things is more that province to province, city to city even. So you were, prior to COVID, already having regular annual meetings between Lao Cai, Vietnam, and Hukou, China, where they talk about transboundary environmental issues. Now, water is currently not on that list because it is deemed to be a state secret or too sensitive, but they are already collaborating around things like biodiversity corridors, for example. So you already have some structure, some relationships formed, and I would look to be building on some of these things. And I do think generally when it gets higher and higher up into foreign affairs ministries, that the opportunities for what you're discussing are reduced. Yeah, I think that would be a more productive, is not focusing on the nation to nation level, probably.
Thank you. Yeah, we have still some questions and comments, people being really also shocked by the results that you've been presenting. And one question, quite a very broad question to you. Do you or anybody else here know of any ongoing developments of how to fix this broken system with the CDM and then these political tensions and environmental impacts that they're creating? Maybe you can sort of link it more to, what essentially determines whether then conflict or cooperation prevail also in these basins that you're examining.
So first, with regards to the CDM, I'm not an economist, but trying to understand what is happening and where is extremely difficult. And I would suggest that I don't even know if it's possible. For example, let's just say you hypothetically, because I wanted to, they say you hypothetically wanted to know which credits are the hydropower credits and where are they. I don't think it's traceable. And so if you look at the documents and some of the companies involved in preparing and packaging these, often these are pretty like innocuous consultancies that have, you know, in some tax haven or something. It's very, very difficult to have sort of to follow the money, if you will, or to transparently look at what's going on. One of the reasons the CDM credits bumped in price even after they had crashed in like the I think it was like mid 2013, 2014, is that a lot of people in North America just started buying voluntary credits. So even though the US wasn't a signatory to Kyoto, all these companies and private people can just purchase them. So it gets very complicated when you start making these new forms of capital. And I don't know how to deal with that aspect. But I think there's many improvements that can be made just in terms of tracing what's happening and who's involved and where these things are going would be at least a starting point.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the time and people really sort of saying, thank you so much, very interesting material, and people also being very interested in what your next steps are. So maybe in sort of one last sort of sentence or comment, people are interested in, what you're going to do with your research and yeah, indeed what you're planning to go forward with this.
Yeah, so as part of the NEWAVE program, all of these papers will be open access. So you'll be free to read these. They're at various stages of review, and we're hoping they'll be out for the public consumption soon. And when they do come out, a NEWAVE and others will probably make announcements. But yeah, they will be open access, so more to come.
Fantastic. So once again, from my side, thank you very much for both of you to share your insights. One person asked whether this will be available online, and I think Paulina will tell us more about it, but indeed it is available via the YouTube channel, so you can also rewatch it or share with others who might be interested. From my side, thank you very much. And once again, it's been a fascinating journey with you, Stu, and I look forward to indeed completing all of this. Thank you, and over to Paulina, and thanks again, Kyung-mi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Johanna. Thank you, Kyung-mi. Thank you, Stu. It was a fantastic session. And looking at the amount of questions that you've received, I think you can also easily see that the public really enjoyed it. Confirming what Johanna just said, indeed, we will be uploading all the sessions to our YouTube channel, the NEWAVE YouTube channel. So you'll be able to access it there. And as a form of a little reminder, I wanted to share the next session in our webinar series. And it will be a session with the early stage researcher Johannes Wagner on policy design and performance of professional drinking water services delivery in rural Mali. And this will be taking in 2 weeks' time. This will be taking place in 2 weeks' time, and we'll be also seeing Dr. Johanna Kuller again as one of the discussants there. Very exciting, as the session today went really smoothly. And just to also mention, the session from our ESR Sina Fekes Grimavolde has been postponed to September. So we'll be meeting in 2 weeks' time with Johannes. There was a little bit of a switch there. And as mentioned, you can always find the sessions on our NEWAVE Network YouTube channel. And I want to thank all the partners that have been part of the NEWAVE Network. And thank you all, audience, for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.